I'm Sandeep Mahendra. I'm head of the Research Access and Collection Development section here in the Library of Congress, the Geography and Map Division. It's my pleasure to welcome you, those of you both in person and online on Zoom, to the library tonight for a talk by our 2023 Phillips Society Fellow, Chet Van Duzer. So a little bit about GNM before we get going. Geography and Map is one of the first special collections with maps and atlases among the first items acquired when the Library of Congress was established in 1800. It's considered the largest public map collection in the world, with more than 5.6 million cartographic items spanning almost the entire history of mapmaking. There's a lot of rich material for Chet and other researchers to explore. Over the years, the Phillips Society members have given maps from their personal collections, in addition to contributions totaling more than $1.2 million. These gifts help develop, enhance, and promote the collections of the Geography and Map Division, which connect to people everywhere. So your contributions also support fellowships like Chet's, so we want to thank you. And many of you, the members of the Phillips Society and those in the Washington Map Society and other regional map societies are among our strongest supporters, and for decades have participated in building these collections. So again, we want to thank you. And we just announced that the applications are now being accepted for 2 Phillips Society fellowship opportunities for the fall. I hope you'll help spread the word, or perhaps apply for your own research project. You can find more information on our website or contact us in the Geography and Map reading room. We'll give you more information. Thanks again for joining us tonight. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce Jeffrey Katz, President of the Washington Map Society.
Let me make sure I have the right slide up here. Good. Well, thank you, Sandeep, and good evening to all, both here and online. It's a special pleasure to open tonight's program at the Library of Congress. This program was arranged by the Washington Map Society in conjunction with the Library of Congress's Phillips Society, so a joint endeavor. As many of you know, the Washington Map Society had its origins in the leadership of the Geography and Map Division of the library. Now, after a couple of years of Zoom-only meetings, we now have had a couple of joint events hosted live at the library, and I'd like to express our thanks to the library staff for making these events possible. Thanks. Tonight, we are continuing with virtual access in partnership with 5 other map societies around the country: the California, Chicago, New York, Rocky Mountain, and Texas map societies. These map societies, all of them, are nonprofit organizations that support map collecting, cartography, and the study of cartographic history. If you are not a member, we hope you will join at least one of these societies. Now, the benefits vary for each society. I can put a plug in for the Washington Map Society. Our members receive 3 annual issues of the Portal-On Journal, digital access to all past issues of the Portal-On, and to our past guest lectures, and there are many other features in the members-only section of the website. And if you're not a member, we have an introductory rate of $25 for digital access. I think I have another slide here. We have advertisers in the journal. We and our partner map societies would like to thank our advertisers who support our groups and also help make possible the publication of the Portal-On and of the Calafia, the Journal of the California Map Society. Now, tonight's program is being recorded. So, number 1, if you don't want to be recorded and are participating virtually, please turn off your microphone and turn off your video. Number 2, as I noted, you'll be able to review the event later at your leisure on our website if you are a member. Now, for our Zoom participants, please use the chat feature for questions or comments during the talk, and they'll be addressed at the end of the program. And finally, for those of you who are members of the Washington Map Society, we will be following this program with our annual business meeting, and I would encourage you to stay on for that, virtually or right here. Finally, I'd like to turn over the program to Ron Grimm to introduce our speaker, Chet Van Duzer. As is well known to many of you, Chet has previously spoken at our lectures and meetings and contributed to our journal. Ron?
Okay, thank you, Jeff and Sandeep. In consultation with the other MAP societies, we have developed a schedule of monthly Zoom and in-person meetings through September 2023, and I am currently working on other meetings for the fall. We'll soon have those in place, and we'll advertise them as appropriate. Next month is really sort of a big month. We're going to have 2 meetings scheduled for Friday, May 19. The first, which has been arranged in conjunction with the Library of Congress Phillips Society, will be held as a hybrid event in the Library of Congress Jefferson Building right here in this room, LJ 119. It will start at 10 a.m. with a coffee hour, followed by a lecture at 11 and a display of treasures at noon. Then the lecture will also be broadcast virtually by the Library of Congress as it is tonight. The speakers will be Jackie Colburn, Library of Congress Rare Book Cataloger, and Anthony Mullen, retired as a cartographic specialist in the Geography and Map Division. The title of their presentation is A Globe on a New Plan, Peter Parley's Innovative Teaching of Geography to Children in 19th Century America. And I might just add, the idea for this talk was brought to me before the pandemic, and because of limitations on research, it could not be completed until recently. So a talk that has been at least around for a while or been inspired for a while will be presented next time. The same day, the Washington Map Society will host its annual dinner meeting starting at 5:30 p.m. at Maggiano's Little Italy restaurant in Tyson's 2 Galleria in McLean, Virginia. Dinner, consisting of an Italian feast, will be served at 6:30 p.m., followed by the evening's lecture at 8 p.m. The presenters are Andrew Adamson, the principal of Heritage Charts, which is a British-based company that produces fine art prints from historic maps, and Frank Limacelli, who is with the Department of Military Science at George Mason University. The title of their presentation is F.W. Desbarres' Great Folly, an examination of Desbarres' foray into the realm of political mapping and the little-known plans he created to that end. They will be focusing on 3 maps, 2 that are at the UK National Archives and 1 that is here in the Geography and Map Division. And we're trying to negotiate having that on display in the afternoon. Now,
sorry, we're having a technical difficulty. We're going to see if this is a temporary solution. I hear my echo in the back. To see if people online can hear.
they can't hear.
They cannot hear.
Okay. Registration for the annual dinner meeting is now live on the Washington Map Society website. And we apologize to our virtual audience that we will not be broadcasting. We will not be broadcasting the presentation online. Okay. Okay. Registration for this event is now live on the Washington Map Society website. Does that work? Okay. Okay. Now let me go on with tonight's program. It is my pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, Chet Van Duzer, and as we've been told already, he's the Phillips Society's 2023 Research Fellow. Chet is well known to many of us because of his numerous publications focusing on medieval and Renaissance maps, and as a board member of the Lazarus Project at the University of Rochester. The title of his presentation is Behold the Mapmaker. Oh, okay. Behold the Mapmaker, Cartographic Self Portraits. As we've indicated before, Chet will address a few of your questions at the end of the presentation. And for those of you on Zoom, if you have questions, please type them in the chat and we'll address them as well. And as we indicated before, after the question and answer period, we will then evolve into the Washington Map Society annual business meeting, which probably won't take too long, but we invite all members to stay in the room or stay online. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron, for that generous introduction, and thank you to the Phillips Society for supporting my research. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for all for coming, both in person and online. We will just jump right in. I hope that this evening's subject proves engaging. We get to interact with the creators of maps a little bit more than usually. So first, some general remarks about self-portraits, not confining ourselves to maps. So there's a phrase in the Bible in Galatians 6:14, God forbid that I should boast of anything but in the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ. And this verse was often quoted in the Middle Ages. It was one of the most explicit New Testament calls to humility and would seem to forbid an artist from boasting about creating a work of art or portraying themselves in a work of art. And talking a little bit about medieval self-portraits, I'm going to give a quote from a book by the Swiss art historian Jacob Burckhardt, The Civilization of the Renaissance in Italy, published in 1860. And in this section, The Development of the Individual, Burckhardt argues that in the Middle Ages, man was conscious of himself only as a member of a race, people, party, family, or corporation, only through some general category. But that in Renaissance Italy, man became a spirited individual and recognized himself as such. So the argument was, this argument would make it unlikely that medieval artists would create self-portraits of themselves. It is true that consciousness of and expressions of individuality, such as autobiographies and self-portraits by artists, increased during the Renaissance, but it is simply false that there were no such consciousness or expressions during the Middle Ages. So going back to that line from Galatians 6:14, this is the Valerianus Gospels in the Bavarian National Library, a manuscript made in about 600. And if we look at the middle of the cross here, we see the words Ego Valerianus Scripsi, I, Valerianus, wrote this manuscript. So he's following Galatians 6:14 exactly. God forbid that I should boast of anything but in the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ. He signs the manuscript right in the middle of the cross. So this shows that there was a willingness to indicate one's selfhood in a work of art. And there's a wonderful book by Anton Legner, the Artifacts, Artists in the Middle Ages and Their Self-Portrayals, an illustrated anthology published in 2009, which shows hundreds of examples of self-portraits by medieval architects, sculptors, painters, goldsmiths, bronze casters, illuminators, and textile artists. So this idea that there was no individuality in the Middle Ages, and therefore that medieval artists would not represent themselves in their work of art, in their works of art, is simply false. And we'll begin by looking at such an example. So this is Lambert of St. Omer's Liber Floridus. This is the autograph manuscript made in 1121. Autograph manuscript meaning that he himself wrote it. And we have above an image of the city of Saint-Omer, where Lambert lived, and below a self-portrait by Lambert. And he depicts himself writing his book, and this is not a small marginal illustration, but a large prominent image of himself. And he also mentions himself by name at 2 other points in the manuscript. And there are maps in this manuscript. So this is a self-portrait by someone who spent time working as a cartographer. So this is a so-called list map, which lists the names of the peoples in Asia, Europe, and Africa, the 3 parts of the world that were known in antiquity and the Middle Ages. There's a so-called zonal mappamundi in this same manuscript on folio 24 verso. There's a spectacular zonal mappamundi that we see here further along in the manuscript. And this map of Europe on folio 241 recto. So in the year 1121, we have a self-portrait by Lambert of St. Omer in a manuscript that includes several maps. That said, most of the examples that we will be considering are post-medieval. And I'm going to give some thoughts from authors who have written about self-representation in the Renaissance. So Stephen Greenblatt's book, Renaissance Self-Fashioning, From Moore to Shakespeare. He writes, perhaps the simplest observation that we can make is that in the 16th century, there appears to be an increased self-consciousness about the fashioning of human identity as a manipulable, artful process. Joanna Woods Marsden, in her book Renaissance Self-Portraiture, has argued that the identity assertiveness of Renaissance painters was stimulated by the artist's need to compete for patronage in courtly societies. And thus, self-portraits in fine clothing with luxury accessories could help forge an image of a sophisticated creator very different from that of a mere craftsman, and such a creator was more worthy of patronage. Peter Burke, in a wonderful sentence, has written that self-portraits need to be regarded as a form of communication, a silent language, a theater of status, a system of signs representing attitudes and values, and as a means to the presentation of self. There are a few earlier brief discussions of cartographic self-portraits. I indicate them here, an article by James Whaley, an article by Rodney Shirley, and an article by Michael Bischoff. But thanks to the generosity of the Phillips Society, I've had the opportunity to delve further into the subject. It's worth mentioning that not all images on maps that might seem to be self-portraits turn out to be self-portraits. So here we have a map of the area around Brandenburg by Joan Blau. And if we zoom in on the lower left-hand corner, we see an image of a man holding a chain and dividers, which is to say tools of a surveyor or mapmaker, to the scale of miles on the map. And he has some help from a little puto. But the man does not look like the cartographer at all. So this seems to be a generic image. So cartographers depicted cartographers on maps who were not themselves. So not every time we see a cartographer on a map, not every time is it a self-portrait. Another similar example in a map by Nicolas de Fer, showing the canal joining the Loire and Seine in France. If we zoom in, We have a boat with the scale of miles on its side, and we have a man in the boat holding the compass rose and looking at the viewer. So the man is breaking the fourth wall and establishing this connection with the viewer. And all of those connections with cartography and connections with the viewer might lead us to think that this is a self-portrait, but he has no distinctive facial features, and in the absence of those features, it's hard to qualify this as a self-portrait. There's also a desire to find self-portraits in maps. We all want to connect with the creator of works we admire. So here's Jacopo de Barbari's spectacular map view of Venice from about 1500. And if we zoom in on the windhead at the right-hand edge of the image, two Italian scholars have suggested that this windhead is a self-portrait by de Barbari. I personally can't convince myself that it is. There certainly is such a thing as a crypto self-portrait, as they're called, where a person in a painting who doesn't seem to have any special role is in fact a self-portrait by the artist. In this case, I can't convince myself that it is. Similarly, on Champlain's map of New France from 1632, so a map of Canada, if we zoom in, Marcel Trudel has suggested that the face in the sun is a self-portrait by Champlain. Again, I just can't convince myself. It doesn't have any distinctive features. So there is this desire, though, to find self-portraits in maps, and I think one has to be a little bit wary of it. I myself have felt that desire. I see an image of a cartographer on a map, and who else could it be but the cartographer? But unless there's further evidence, I think we have to be hesitant about making that identification. It's also worth saying a few words about self-portrait versus self-representation. So when we see a self-portrait in a painting, it is by a painter who actually painted this image of himself. When we see images of cartographers on maps, even images of the person who made the map, it wasn't always made by that person. They may not have engraved the plate or cut the woodcut or even made the preliminary drawing. It's quite likely that there was some person who helped them in creating that image. So it's not quite the same as a self-portrait. But I think it's still useful to use that term insofar as even if someone else actually created the image, the cartographer no doubt had a lot of control over what was appearing on the map, and particularly a lot of control over their own representation on the map. So finally, after that long preamble, we'll get into some cartographic self-portraits. So this is one of the earliest examples I know of. We had Lambert of Saint-Omer earlier, but this is a self-portrait on a map rather than in a manuscript that has maps. So this is a map of the Black Sea in an atlas of nautical charts by Pietro Visconti, made in 1318. And we can see there are figures in the corners of the chart. So we have an image of St. Julian, St. Peter, St. Paul, and then in the upper left-hand corner, a cartographer. And if we zoom in, we can see the rhumb lines on the chart in front of the cartographer so that we know he's making a nautical chart like the one in the main map. And above we have the signature of the cartographer. So it says, Petrus Visconti made this map in Venice in the year of our Lord, 1318. And the proximity of this image to the signature, I think, helps confirm that this is indeed a self-portrait rather than just an image of a cartographer making a nautical chart. Jumping ahead in time to 1564, a map of England and Ireland by Lawrence Noel in the British Library. So on the lower right, we have a portrait of William Cecil, the patron, and thus the more powerful figure. And he's next to England, which is the more powerful country. So the locations of the two, the portrait and the self-portrait on the map, are not located by accident. And then moving to the lower left-hand corner, here we do have a self-portrait by the cartographer, Lawrence Noel. And the less powerful figure, the cartographer, rather than the patron, is next to Ireland, the less powerful country. If we zoom in, and Noel is in a despondent pose, showing us his empty purse. And he's being set upon by a barking dog, which is the age-old enemy of surveyors. And there's an inscription beside him from Hesiod's Works and Days, which indicates that after Pandora opened her jar, hope was the only spirit that stayed there in the unbreakable closure of the jar, under its rim, and could not fly forth. So he's suggesting that all the cartographer has is hope. Certainly no money, and is being set upon by a dog. This is Urbano Monte's spectacular manuscript world map of 1587, which is in the David Rumsey Map Center at Stanford University. This is a digital composite, so the map is actually in 60 sheets, but the Rumsey Center brought them all together digitally to form this image of the world. And just to orient ourselves a little bit, here's North America, South America, Africa, Asia, and the North Pole, so it's on a North Polar projection. We have the prime meridian here off the coast of Africa. And then below we have Urbano Monte's two cartouches with Urbano Monte's address to the reader and his coat of arms. And it's worth mentioning that usually if there's a coat of arms on a map, it is the coat of arms of the person who commissioned the map rather than the person who made the map. And we'll see other signs of Urbano Monte's ego later. So here on the right is his coat of arms. Then on the left, we have the cartouche with his address to the reader and his self-portrait at age 45. So we zoom in and see that here. This is actually a paste down. And if we lift it up, we can see an earlier self-portrait of Urbano Monte at age 43. And if we put them side by side, I think this is a very interesting case where what we have on the left, we can see that the level of artistic sophistication is lower, whereas the image on the right is quite well executed. So I think what we have is on the left an actual self-portrait that Urbano Monte made himself, and then he decided that he wanted to look a little bit better, and he hired an artist to make the portrait on the right, but again, still having considerable control over how he was represented. So Urbano Monte made, two other world maps. His map from 1590 was printed. And I'm showing here the southern part of the map, which is to say its outer edge, because it also is on a North Polar projection. And at the bottom we have some texts describing different regions of the world here, Arabia, Scythia, and Armenia, and portraits of the poet Ludovico Ariosto and the explorer Marco Polo. And the whole outer edge of the map has these blocks of textual description and portraits of explorers and poets and other cultural figures. So looking at another part of this map, again, this is on the outer edge, we have portraits of the explorer Alvise Cadamosto, the Portuguese explorer, and the Greek poet Homer. In between, and much larger, we have Monte himself. And there's a motto just below his face that says, "Behold the Monte, the mountain, that all the world has discovered." So we can see that his ego was a little bit out of control here, making himself larger than the Greek poet Homer and the Portuguese explorer Cadamosto. Moving forward into the 17th century, this is a world map by Octavius Pisani on 12 sheets. It's very idiosyncratic. We saw that Urbanamonte's map was on a north polar projection. This one is on a south polar projection. So it places at the center of its image of the world the least known part of the world, which is an interesting choice to say the least. And if we zoom in, the map reverses all of the world's geography east to west, putting Brazil, for example, on the wrong side of South America. So it's a very curious map. And it has a self-portrait by Pisani, which you see here. And the phrase around his self-portrait translates to read, "Nothing is easier or more base than to traduce or mock the works of others without true judgment." So he's very petulantly trying to forestall any criticism of his map. He made a later map, 25 years later in 1637, which also includes a self-portrait. It's on the same projection, so a south polar projection, but he returns the world's geography to its conventional orientation and adds more decoration around the map. So we'll zoom in on his self-portrait. It's a more elaborate self-portrait, and strangely and very suggestively, he positions himself between personifications of sensual pleasure, voluptas, and desire, desiderium. It's difficult to know what to make of that. Zooming in, he's again very interested in forestalling criticism. So he writes, "To the slanderer, O you who slander this work, make you a better form of the work according to its goals. That is to say, draw the globe as round and as one on a plane at the same time." So he's challenging the reader who criticizes his map to try to do what he's doing better. He stands ready or sits ready with his sword and armor at his side, ready to defend his work. So he's quite a character. Meanwhile, he pretends to demonstrate the method of projection he used. So he has a globe in front of him on the table, and he's pretending to roll this globe around as his way of transferring geographical information onto his map. But this is not a realistic image at all. That wouldn't generate the type of image that we see on his map. But we see that Pisani is quite a character. This is Ilhard Lubin's map of Pomerania. The map was made in 1618, but all but one of the initial print run have disappeared. This copy was printed in 1758. The printing plates were rediscovered. So we have at the top the family tree of Philip II, Duke of Pomerania. The lower right, Philip II and his nobles. And then a self-portrait by Lubin near the bottom margin of the map. So if we zoom in, we see that he's portraying himself with his surveying tools and holding the dividers to the scale of miles. So all of this to proclaim his identity as the cartographer and also guarantee the quality of his work. So he himself, he's suggesting visually, did the surveying that generated this map. There's also two words of Greek just above him, ta ano, which mean the things that are above. And this is an allusion to Colossians 3:2, set your minds on the things that are above, not on the things that are on earth. This is a very strange phrase for a cartographer to utter. His whole profession is concerned with things of the earth, specifically the geography of the earth, but here he's saying focus on the things above, and he's basically telling us that he has another profession as a theologian. So an interesting piece of self-revelation on this map. Where is he looking? He's looking across the map directly at his patron, Philip II. So he knows where his bread is buttered. A few self-portraits by Klaus-Jans Vischer. I say a few because Vischer was quite fond of putting self-portraits on his maps. His last name means fisherman, and he portrays himself as a fisherman on his maps. He also uses the Latin word pescator, fisherman, to identify himself in some cases. So here is his map from 1630 of southern Germany. If we zoom in, we can see here he is, identified as a fisherman. Cartographers certainly depict fishermen on maps who are not the cartographer. In this case, the depiction is just above his signature, which helps confirm that this is indeed a self-portrait, and that confirmation is also assisted by the many other maps of his where we see this same image, such as the following map from 5 years later, 1635. If we zoom in, we can see that his name is directly above the fisherman, leaving no doubt that this is a self-portrait. And again, there are many of his maps have this self-portrait of him as a fisherman. What I would like to do in the future is try to determine if there's any pattern as to on which maps he portrays himself and which he does not. This is another Vischer's, Georg Matthias Vischer's map of southern Austria. Again, designed in 1670, printed in this case in 1697. If we zoom in on the lower part of the map, we have the cartographer supplying us a double portrait. So first he depicts himself surveying to show us that his map is based on first-hand information, so assuring us of the accuracy of his work. And then also holding a banner with the map's legend, that is, the explanation of the various symbols on the map. And the cartographer here breaks the fourth wall to engage directly with the viewer. And this is sometimes a bit of corroboratory evidence that helps confirm that an image on a map is a self-portrait when we have that person looking directly at the viewer. This is Vincenzo Coronelli's huge terrestrial globe made in 1681 to 83 for the King of France. And here we have this enormous cartouche in the southern Indian Ocean with the dedication to Louis XIV. And there is no self-portrait on this globe. But a few years later, when he made what is essentially a smaller version of this globe, he changed his mind and decided to include a self-portrait. So here's a composite image of the gores of Coronelli's 1688 globe, and I'll just mention that Geography and Maps at the Library of Congress owns a copy of this globe and also owns a beautiful copy of the gores of this globe. And here is the corresponding cartouche in the Southern Ocean, Southern Indian Ocean, with the dedication of the globe to Venice and its Doge. So here we have a personification of Venice enthroned, personifications of mathematics and geography, a personification of astronomy who presents to the personification of Venice first a personification of fire, earth, air, water, and then down below, three putti reveal a portrait of Cornelli directly beneath the throne. So very curiously, Cornelli shows not himself in person, but rather a portrait of himself, as if sovereigns keep portraits of their favorite cartographer at the foot of their thrones. And Cornelli identifies himself twice by name and also advertises a book of his, the Atlante Veneto. So we feel his presence quite strongly here, particularly in the double repetition, the repetition of his name and the advertisement of his work. And it's interesting that between making his earlier globe in 1681 to 83 and making this globe in 1688, he decided to add, as it were, a self-portrait of himself. This is a map of Tartaria Magna, or Northeast Asia, by Philip Johann von Strahlenberg and J.A. Martin. And in the cartouche in the lower right-hand corner, we have first a miniature version of the whole map with text on it about Russian units of measure, and then portraits of the two cartographers, self-portraits of the two cartographers, one on the left using dividers on the scale of miles. This is perhaps Strahlenberg. And on the right, a self-portrait by the other cartographer, perhaps Mattern, pulling a rope to reveal the miniature version of the map. And in between them, the cartographers depict themselves as having been freed from shackles. And the motto below says per vincula, through shackles. And this is an allusion to the great difficulties they went through in gathering information for this map and getting the map printed. It was a long ordeal. If we look at the other lower corner of this map, the lower left-hand corner, we have another cartouche. And we have here an image of Prometheus in chains. So we'll zoom in a little bit. And we saw in the other cartouche this reference to chains. Well, here we have Prometheus in chains. And I think we're to understand in this image of Prometheus in chains an allusion, another way of representing the cartographer and all the suffering he went through in getting this map made. This is a map of Calabria made in 1784 by Padre Eliseo della Concezione in 9 sheets. The map shows different degrees of damage from earthquakes in different cities in Calabria, and thus is the first seismic map of any part of Italy. I guess this is getting out on us. The cartouche in the lower right-hand corner lists the 7 locations where Della Concezione determined the latitude using his macchina equatoriale, so a special instrument for determining latitude. And if we zoom in on the lower left-hand corner, we have a self-portrait by Della Concezione using his macchina equatoriale to determine latitude. So this is a powerful self-portrait that functions to guarantee the accuracy and quality of the map. He's shown using this special machine to determine latitude. And just an illustration of this special machine from another work published in Naples in 1784. Francisco Requena's map of several rivers in Colombia, right on the equator. We can see the equator labeled in the center of the map. We'll focus on the cartouche. So here is the title cartouche. Let's see if we can get this to work. Zoom in on the top of the cartouche, we have a self-portrait of the cartographer as surveyor. So again, a guarantee of the quality of the map. And in the lower right-hand corner, this is another case where we have a double self-portrait, 2 self-portraits by the same cartographer on the same map. We have an image of Requena drawing the cartouche. If we look closely at the image, we can see he's drawing that cliff face that is the cartouche. And this suggests the possibility of an endless nested series of images of the cartographer drawing himself in the cartouche. And in fact, what we have here is an image drawn by Requena of Requena drawing Requena. So we have some of that recursiveness present here, in addition to the suggestion of the possibility of sort of infinite recursion. This is John Hamilton Robinson's map of Mexico, Louisiana, and the Missouri Territory from 1819. Robinson was quite a character, an explorer, soldier, spy, diplomat, and cartographer. He wanted Mexico to be free of Spain's control and actually schemed to raise an army of US volunteers to go to Mexico to fight Spain. And his idea was that with Mexico free of Spain's control and influence, North America could set its own course under the leadership of the United States, naturally. The map itself focuses on the border between the United States and Spanish territory, the Spanish territory of Mexico. But the cartouche focuses on something different, which is Robinson's dreams of facilitating an alliance between Mexico and the United States. So zooming in, we have a personification of fame above, a personification of Mexico showing the chains from which she has been freed, so the chains of Spanish control, with Mexico's coat of arms. A personification of the United States offering something to Mexico, it's not clear to me what. The coat of arms of the United States. And then Robinson himself, front and center, tying a ribbon to join the two coats of arms together. So this is his image of him facilitating this alliance between the United States and Mexico. And this tradition, which we see has been going on for centuries, of cartographic self-portraits, continues into 20th century pictorial maps. So here we have a nightclub map of Harlem from 1933, which is to say during Prohibition, by E. Sims Campbell, who was the first black illustrator who was syndicated in the United States, and he made illustrations for, I think, every issue of Esquire for several decades, 3 or 4 perhaps. And in the lower right-hand corner, by the statement of his authorship, we have his self-portrait. And so he's the man with the big pen, right by his signature, and it's a very enjoyable, I think, self-portrait. There's a lot of gusto and even braggadocio in it. So we see that this tradition of the cartographer depicting him or herself continues into 20th century pictorial maps. And I'll just mention that the line below, light wines and beer, is from a famous anti-prohibition song of the time. So a few more examples from pictorial maps is Carrie Lee's map of Oxford from 1948. And as we'll see, Carrie Lee was fond of placing a self-portrait in the lower right-hand corner of his maps and portraying himself with his dog. So his map of Cambridge from 1948. Again, in the lower right-hand corner, we see him with his dog, and in this case, he's writing basically his signature on the piece of paper in front of him. His map of Stratford-upon-Avon from 1948. Again, in the lower right-hand corner, we have Lee's self-portrait with his dog, and again, he's writing his signature. He seems to be portraying himself making the map, but he's actually portraying himself writing his signature. So a few conclusions. It's it's interesting, I think, the variety of functions that self-portraits can perform on maps. So we can see that they can function as a signature. They can function as a guarantee of the map's quality and accuracy. It can announce a cartographer's other profession, so convey biographical information about the cartographer. It can allude to the cartographer's past, in this case, the allusion to the great difficulties that the cartographers had in bringing this map to publication. It can express and feed the cartographer's vanity. It can express political ambitions. It can defy or challenge the viewer. And it can play philosophically with the possibilities of self-representation. So in Requena's map, this idea of he's represented himself, representing himself, there's a certain philosophical element to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chet. We're going to open up to some questions, but first we did have a comment from Mike Flaherty that on the Robinson map, the image is the U.S. offering a Liberty cap.
Oh, very good. Great, thank you.
Any questions?
Thank you. Well, first of all, that was a fabulous presentation, so thank you so much for that. I wondered whether any of these cartographers were featured in paintings so that you could verify the similarity of the images.
Yes, there's one case I have in mind where there's actually a self-portrait by a cartographer in a painting, and then also a self-portrait on a map by that man. And there are cases where we have other images of the cartographer that let us confirm in the clearest possible way that it is a self-portrait. There are also other cases where we don't have that confirmation. We have to look at other clues, which raises the question of what are the criteria, in the absence of another image of the cartographer, what are the criteria for having confidence that the image is a self-portrait? And proximity to the signature is one. If the cartographer breaks the fourth wall and looks directly at the viewer, I think that's another clue. And that's something I continue to work on, is what exactly are the criteria that allow us to decide?
Could you tell us what has been your greatest find or your most surprising find here at the library?
Yes, greatest find at the library. Well, I had the opportunity to look at some pictorial maps, and there's a series made by a couple who had a company in the Northwest, and many of their maps are, the name of the company was Tour Map, and they started the company in, I think, 1968, and in about 1974, they started putting self-portraits on their maps, and they always depict themselves together. And so over the years, they came out with versions of these maps each year. Over the years, you can see how their clothing changes. At one point, they acquired a dog. The dog features in a number of their maps. There's a case where I think it was their daughter got married, and there's an image of the two mapmakers with their daughter and her husband. So that was a lot of fun to trace their history over the years through these self-portraits.
Any other questions?
I have never, ever related at all to self-portraits on maps. This is so enlightening. How old were you? What even made you, what directed you? I wouldn't even know what to look for. Just a bit of your history in
Well, this project grew out of a study of cartouches on maps. And it's when self-portraits appear on maps, it's often within cartouches. So in the course of studying cartouches, I had accumulated a number of examples of self-portraits, and I was familiar with the bibliography on the subject, which is rather sparse. And so it struck me as a great opportunity. And there was a piece of the talk that I cut out for time. But if we look at Vasari's book about Italian painters, in his second edition in 1568, it includes 144 portraits of painters. So this shows a strong interest in seeing the creators of paintings. 2 years later, Abraham Ortelius published his Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, this atlas, the first modern atlas, basically. And it has 4 pages about cartographers. So 3 volumes with 144 portraits versus 4 pages and no portraits whatsoever. So I think there has been a tendency to neglect self-portraits on maps, and this seemed like a great opportunity to try and do something about that.
So sometimes we talk about the content of a map being determined by who makes the map. And so did you see any connections between, self-portraits, somebody putting their person on the map and their perspective, their personality, their place in society, whatever, and the content of the map of which they created and put their self-portrait on?
It's tempting to see a connection between idiosyncratic maps and cartographers putting their portraits, self-portraits on maps. So I'm thinking particularly of Urbano Monte's map. He wasn't a professional cartographer. The map is idiosyncratic in a few different ways. It was, the North Polar projection is certainly not without precedent, but a bit unusual. And the map was also designed to be rotated, which is quite unusual. It has other unusual features, and he also chose to represent himself on it. And then the Pisani map, with its South Polar projection, which is even more idiosyncratic, and his reversal of all the world's geography, east to west, and then he put his very combative self-portrait on the map. So at least in some cases, I think if the map is idiosyncratic, we see that that generates a self-portrait, and I think we're to see well, we see that explicitly with Pisani, but the cartographer wanting to defend their work a little bit, and also pride, if it's not something they do all the time. So both Urbano Monte and Pisani did not devote their lives to cartography, so they had a particular pride in their maps and thus a desire to put their stamp on them, as it were.
We have one question from online from Marguerite Ragnow. She asks, have you ever come across a self-representation of a cartographer as surveyor when you know absolutely that he never worked in the field?
So there are lots of self-representations of cartographers as surveyors on maps. I'm trying to think. That's a great question. I can't come up with an example, but it wouldn't surprise me at all if there were, and I will keep my eye out for such an example.
So who were the viewers or collectors of those maps, and how were those self-portraits perceived by them?
I wish I had a good answer to that question. So how were the self-portraits perceived by the people who owned these maps? I'm not recalling a single case where someone made a comment about the self-portrait. But as to who owned the maps, I really can't generalize, because some were manuscript maps, some of which were made on commission. Urbano Monte's map was not made on commission. It's given its size, it seems like something that would have been made for an Italian nobleman. But what Urbano Monte actually says is that his intention for the map was that it would be used in education, which is a bit surprising. But anyway, I wish I could offer some insight into how the self-portraits were perceived, but I'm not coming up with any evidence about that. But again, I'll keep my eyes out.
Any other questions? Anything else online, James? That is all from the online.
Great.
Thank
Well,
you so much.
Chet, we have a few gifts for you from the Map Society, just as a token of our appreciation. And I don't see any portraits on here. But this is a set of note cards depicting Capitol Hill, made by a company here in DC.
Wonderful.
Called Territory, and then a cut line map of DC.
Thank you very much.
So thanks very much.
Thank you. Well, again, thank you all for coming. This has been a lot of fun for me. I hope it was fun for you. And as you know when the next talk is.